Welcome to Embracing Differences. This is Nippin, and I have with me David. And David, let's. So what shall we talk about in this podcast? Tell me.
Well, I think for me, I'd like to continue a conversation we started a couple of months ago when I was in a taxi with you and another person who were from a maritime background, and you were talking about, very visceral risk, anchor handlers and very high tension cables and what happens when those things can snap, which, to be honest, made me feel a bit queasy. And it got me kind of thinking about the difference between those industries where the sense of risk really is sort of personal and visceral and real danger to the human, and the world I work in, which is finance and banking, which perhaps can seem a little bit more abstract, and then how we use language, think about risks in a different way. And I think understanding how it's thought about in finance and how it's thought about in maritime would be quite an interesting conversation.
I think so, but it's interesting that you see the risks in the maritime world as more. You use the word visceral and more real in some ways, whereas what you describe in the banking sector is more abstract. Um, as someone who works as an entrepreneur, I see I see the risk with finance as much more real than anything else, because if you don't have finance, you will, any business will die its natural death within hours, forget about days. So here we are, metaphors we live by, and I think it's a classic start, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you just said that, businesses will die a natural death, so you used a metaphor there yourself. Yeah.
That's
But
right.
yeah, I mean, it is fundamentally important to the lifeblood of, there's another metaphor of industry and businesses. But actually, when you're on the inside of it, a lot of the way you're talking about the reality of what you're doing, obviously, is not to talk about the rather dull functional processes you're going through. It's to put in very interesting and a plethora of metaphors. So, I think an interesting place maybe to start would be sort of weather type metaphors, because they're often used in finance to talk about the wider economy and the impact upon a firm and the impact upon its specific industries. Whereas obviously, if you're in maritime, it's a real thing you're facing day to day, which is absolutely the risk. Whereas in banks, it's sort of shaping it a different way and either inferring it's something that's maybe out of their control, or inferring the danger that comes from it. But it's not real in the banking sense. We're not actually suffering that, but we're using it as a metaphor.
Of course, and even before we get into this very wonderful conversation, the meaning of a metaphor is that you're applying one concept in another domain, and transporting it across domains. And yes, that's the essence of all metaphorical thinking, that you use one word from one particular domain and you use it in another domain. And just drawing on that weather-tight metaphor, absolutely, David. In the maritime world, weather-tight means you're now ready. You are ready to take the winds and the weather, because you are, in essence, as a ship, you are weather-tight. You have tightened the hatches. You have secured for the seas, and come what may, you are now secure and safe to take the weather, and hence the word weather-tight. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, and I think in finance and banking, it's kind of used almost the other way around. It's where there's a situation where there's a sense that it's not within the control of the institutions themselves, they will err towards weather type metaphors to sort of say, well, hey, what can we do? It was outside of our control. And I think it's very interesting if you look at the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, that there was critique of some senior bankers in some research that was done, because they were probably it's not deliberate. I think it's so deep within how you frame situations, sort of saying, well, it was a once in a generation storm. It was, an act of God, which is obviously quite handy, because then you can say, well, you can shrug your metaphorical shoulders and say, well, there wasn't much we could do about it. So yeah, it's how is that used in that particular frame versus maritime, where it is well, you literally need to know your weather tight, as you say.
And you have some studies done to prove that once in a 30 years storm. So there is some rational explanations, some scientific explanations based on that. And now you take that metaphor and transport it into the banking world, and you apply it to your advantage to be seen as everything you have done in your capacity to manage the risk. Whereas, it's in some ways what you're saying, if I understand it right, is that how often we use metaphors to mislead the world, um, in some ways.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think and
Sorry.
unthinkingly, and I think strangely, to mislead ourselves as well, actually. And I think a good category of that is that which we've just discussed, which is maybe something that was more in the control of banks than they inferred because of, the structure of the products and how things were sold to in institutions, how the regulators were behaving, how rating agencies were behaving. There's lots of human agency in there. Um, and yet it's put as a completely outside our control act of God. And I think the complete reverse happens as well, is that oftentimes there are things that people sense are complex, but they like to frame them as more structured and rigid to make them feel like they are in control. So, there's quite a lot of metaphors used in banking which are quite mechanical, lines of defense and frameworks and walls, etc., um, which can ease the fevered brow of those who work in banks. But actually, counterintuitively, they're sort of maybe oversimplifying things, and maybe that metaphor isn't particularly helpful. So I think they can go both ways.
It's interesting, and I don't know if you've heard this one in the banking world, but there is, you're right. I mean, just building upon that, David, we have a metaphor called "Don't stand in the line of fire." So this comes from the maritime industry. It has been widely overused and misused in the maritime world. Many years ago, we used to have uh, lots of accidents on the ship with mooring lines. At the poop deck, which is the aft deck, which is a metaphor in itself. The poop deck. Um, uh, and also in the forecastle, which is another metaphor. So you have all these mooring lines spread all over the place on the ship, and the poor seafarer, when the line is under tension, what happens is that it can snap and it can go in any direction. So some calculations were done to work out that there are some parts of the deck that are safer than the others, and if you were to paint them yellow, and you could more or less keep the seafarers safe when they are standing in between those tensed lines. And we started to paint those areas, and and the slogan that became the slogan of the day was, "Don't stand in the line of fire." And what it did was it confused the hell out of people even more, because when the ropes are under tension, and not every port and not every ship has the same structure. So when the rope is under tension and it parts, it can actually go in any direction. You're not safe anywhere. So where do you go now? Where do you stay? And some accidents actually showed that those places that were painted yellow actually became more unsafe during the course of mooring operations. So this idea of the line of fire became a joke, actually, because where do you go? Everywhere on the ship or everywhere on the poop deck is line of fire. And hence, how metaphors actually this that give comfort to some people. They give a sense of control, actually are much more misleading than anything else. It's exactly what you said, is that we create language to give us a sense of control, but it's actually very delusional.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's very interesting, the metaphor you've used there, because I think my interpretation of that, and probably the general public's interpretation, is they probably thought it came from a battlefield context. And then certainly in general parlance, it's become just keep your head down and don't put your hand up, and don't volunteer for anything because you'll get yourself in trouble. So it has shifted, I think, in its kind of general usage. Yeah. Um, another interesting set of metaphors, which would be interesting to see what they'll read across from banking into maritime, is the kind of animalistic ones. I think if you go from weather, which appears very out of control, into animals which maybe appear slightly dangerous in some respects, or you can try to tame it, but maybe that's difficult. Finance is full of them. Obviously we have our bull and bear markets, which are both seem to be quite dangerous animals. Either they're going up or they're going down, but you can't quite control them. And different types of risks as well. You have black swans and you have grey rhinos and you have all sorts of different ways that people are trying to. I was going to say personify, but that's not the right word with an animal. But again, interested as to how that reads across into maritime and the use of animals and what it's trying to say.
And I think this could be a wonderful place to bring this conversation to some kind of a conclusion, because what I actually went to one company, David, and they were full of words like black swan, all the way from the senior management to the shop floor. And the interesting thing is that nobody had a clue what a black swan actually means. Everyone had a different view on what a black swan is. So my point is this, and I think this could be a really interesting thing to summarize our discussion, that it is so important to understand the symbolic nature of language. Is that you might have one thing in your mind when you talk about something, but if you do not dare to ask another person what it means to them, then I think we are in a big danger of creating subcultures and creating misunderstandings within the organization. And I think that's so important. That is the power of a metaphor, that as much as it gives you a sense of understanding and creating some kind of control, which is what understanding is all about, it can actually very, very quickly rob it away from you, because you have no idea what the other person is thinking, what sort of images come to their minds when we talk about black swans and weather tight and so on.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think that echoes the point we made earlier about standing in the line of fire. What it originally meant now has a completely different interpretation. And what was expected perhaps of people to watch out for these risks is now taken on the interpretation of don't volunteer for things because you might get, become in the line of fire. So yeah.
Absolutely, yes, and I actually post very, very regularly on LinkedIn. You might have seen, and one of the things I find very interesting is that in my world, in the risk and safety world, when you write about a story, people take it literally. They take it very literally. So I recently wrote a story about a hummingbird on a tree, and the forest is on fire, and the hummingbird is reluctant to fly off, because she feels that she has, ever since she is born, she has lived in this forest, and the forest has given it food, water supplies, and so on. So it's metaphorically speaking, symbolically speaking, it's a story of reciprocity, mutuality, and relationship, and ecosystems, and so on, and how trust is so important, particularly in times of crisis. But it's so interesting to watch people taking that story literally and thinking that this hummingbird is going to die if it doesn't fly off. So what an idiotic thing for that hummingbird to actually stay there. And our point is in this podcast is very simple, that you have no idea what a word means, what a metaphor means, until you engage with the other person to understand its true meaning. So often companies, CEOs, senior managers send emails, slogans, messages, but they never care to ask people from the other side to say, what does it mean to you? And I think there is where the power of the metaphor lies. What are your thoughts, David?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've obviously extended from the metaphor to the full narrative, and I think exactly the same is that human beings are storytelling animals, and it's how we make sense out of things. But equally with a metaphor, it can really help explain things in terms that people can more easily engage with, but equally can be misleading if it takes them down a path which is simple to absorb and understanding, but maybe isn't the right approach to framing a particular topic. So incredibly powerful, but also can obscure as well as enlighten.
Obscure as well as enlightened. I love that. So maybe that could be the title of this podcast: metaphors, how they obscure and how they enlighten. Great. Is there anything else you want to share, David?
No, I think that's great for today. But yeah, lots of rich content there, I think, to explore in more detail.
Great, great, great. I'll stop there then.